in Nevada, or Nevada, depending on how you like to say it. So what happened is, if you remember, the California gold rush was in 1849, all right, and it's sort of been mined out. And then there was gold discovered in the Black Hills. That's here in South Dakota. But what happens is, one of the largest silver deposits in the world is discovered in Nevada in 1859. So these are the 59ers, they're sometimes called, right? The 59ers. And these are the folks that go out to Nevada and Eastern California, and ultimately some of these are going to end up in Alaska. So they're going to come out here and mine. And there is if you have Netflix, there's a really cool Netflix movie series about life in the West. And it features short little movies, like little clips. The name of the movie is, is it Adventures of, it's not Stinky Pete. It's a cowboy movie on Netflix. I'm gonna tell you, because you're gonna dig it, particularly the scene about the miners. The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. That's what it's called. The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. And in this movie, by the Coen brothers, the guys that did Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, and Django, and stuff like that. No, they didn't do Django. Quentin Tarantino did Django. But anyway, it's pretty awesome vignette movie. It's got like little scenes from different parts of the West. And in it, one of the more interesting ones, played by a musician named Tom Waits, where he is a miner. And he goes into this absolutely gorgeous location, this pristine wilderness. And he mines by looking in a creek first. So he looks in this creek, right? Here he is. And he's looking for tiny little flecks of gold. So this is called panning for gold. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this or not. And when he finds the flecks, and you can see the stream here, he backtracks up the hill and then starts this sort of like geological survey. And he digs down, and he's looking for the spot where in the ground is gold. And once he finds just a little, like the source of where it's coming down to the creek, he then digs down in it, and he finds a vein. So here in the ground is this like strip of gold. And then he just starts digging. It's all these piles and piles of. So it's really great. So this is what a prospector would do. Keep in mind, back then in the wilderness, nobody owned this officially. Like, certainly somebody claimed it. But if you went out here, you could just be a prospector and stake a claim. Now, the book points out that most of these guys go bust. Here he is coming out. All right, that's the valley he's been mining gold in. Okay, so it's this beautiful wilderness. So they would mine. They would first look in the pan, and then they would go dig for it. And so you can see, if you know the Toy Story movies, a prospector, is this Stinky Pete? Yeah. He becomes part of the world of the Toy Story culture, and certainly part of the zeitgeist. So these guys mostly go bust. They mostly don't make it. They don't succeed. In fact, they say the people who mined the miners are the ones who really make the money. The guys that did laundry, the guys that owned taverns, the ladies that owned brothels, that was where the real money was. But nonetheless, these folks are going to come out here, these miners. And you definitely should know that, and particularly in the silver mines of Nevada. Also in the 80s and 90s will be what's called the Yukon Gold Rush, or the Klondike Gold Rush, which is on the Yukon River in Alaska and Canada. But in reality, so many of these Western industries are going to go this direction. Meaning this guy, while he might be able to make a little money for himself, he can't really mine gold at the scale that is needed by the people who want gold. That means the industry becomes mechanized. And so just like what's happening with the American coal industry to get today, which is owned by coal companies and use massive machines, the gold industry and silver mining industry will become a huge industry owned by bankers in New York. You understand? This company right here, for example, the Anaconda Company, was partially owned by J.P. Morgan. It was one of his companies. So it's an industrial society that we're living in, and so these kind of folks, I think, tend to be exaggerated in the mythos of the West, but they're so much more cooler than looking at a strip mine, right? Like but that's the industrial nature of what ultimately emerges in the 19th century, in the Gilded Age. Now, not necessarily these guys, but this kind of behavior would happen pretty early on. So another thing that was a hallmark of the mining industry were what were called the boom towns. Okay, the boom towns. And so I see here that I have a list of what were the results. So I think we should make this list together. Whoops, I don't want the house on the prairie background. Let me copy this. Actually, let me copy this one. And so if you'll turn to your text, let's take a look at what it looks like I'm having a look. The results of the mining industry. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys contribute if you've done any reading, and if you haven't, I'll let you look for it. Results. I don't want that kind of box. Sorry. But who's done their reading?
I have.
All right. So do you have the results?
Yeah. So one of them I have: attracted population and wealth while advertising the West.
So results of mining boom. I got tired of me doing all of this. So I said, maybe you guys should talk about it first from the text. So attracted Western settlers, right? And what else did you say?
Opportunities for men and women makes it the first state to have its own equality.
All right. So men and women treated as equals. Remember Wyoming suffrage, right? Good.
And then it already has capital for
Yeah,
Civil
capital.
War.
Remember what capital is: the gold and silver for the war, right? And railroads. Okay.
Intensified conflict between whites and Indians.
Guys, definitely every time a white group came out, the natives didn't like it. But keep in mind, that there was this prevailing notion that white people believed, I think relatively correctly, that Native Americans didn't own land, and thus they believed they were wasting it. Keep that in mind. That's a mentality. If you don't own the land, you're wasting it. So to give you an example I like to use is here. I love the open land here. Now I realize that for farmers, they're paying taxes on it, although they get here in our county, we have what is called land use, which is a tax deduction if you're using it for agriculture or things like that. But I like it. It's lovely. It's beautiful. It's what makes the country, so to speak. But I have been around people who were like, look at that big open field, man. That's a great place to put, a trailer park. Or look at that big open field. That'd be a great place to put a Dollar General. So they look at a beautiful field and say that should be filled in. Like that's wasted space. And so in many ways, white America looked at the West and said that's wasted space. That needs to have people in it. And thus the Native Americans who roamed far and wide. Remember, they didn't have like 160-acre homestead. They had a 10,000-acre frontier where they hunted the buffalo. And that was not compatible with what industrial 19th century Americans wanted to do. Like you couldn't have buffalo hordes roaming through here. Okay. But you're right. It's definitely going to lead to conflict. All right. I got two more.
You got two more? Enabled Treasury to resume specie payments in 1879.
Yeah. So I definitely want you guys to remember this. Resumed specie purchase, and think things like the Land Allison Act, that's the one he just mentioned, and Sherman Silver Purchase Act. So even though they didn't coin silver, they bought it. They didn't make money out of it necessarily. They did make it, but they didn't circulate it. And the goal of that was to placate or make happy these Western silver states. And the last one for you.
Injected the silver issue into American politics.
Very good. Excellent. That's the kind of participation I've been missing. All right. And then the book mentions also this becomes part of the American folklore, the tradition of groups of people that made America. So like, for example, Stinky Pete, or the Ballad of Buster Scruggs. while these were not that many people, they take on a sort of giant-sized role in American mythos, American past. Okay, good. Thank you very much. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Now, guys, I love to hear more of that from you guys when we do the reading. Now, the other big group that we want to look at, not big group, but other group we want to consider are the cowboys. Now, I do want to remind you that this image is sort of a rarity. Most of your cowboys really didn't do this necessarily, but these are the actual people that Remington has painted here who led the long drive. And here you can see African-American cowboys who are also, they made up a sizable percentage of both, frontier soldiers, but also frontier cowboys. All right. And so not only did black cowboys exist, there were also Hispanic cowboys, people from New Mexico and Arizona. So what exactly does a cowboy do, a person like this? This is their major job was to run the cow long drive. So the cattle drive, I think I have a map of it here. I know there's one in your book. Yeah. So if you think about it, what they would do, and cows are, and sheep too, but cows are like giant lawnmowers. They just, I can look out here at Mr. Gerald's farm, and what you have to do is have lots of pasture land, and they just eat and eat and eat and eat. And they get big, and then eventually you sell them, and then you kill them. All right. And so the problem was, and they would start down here in Texas. So if you think about like the Dallas Cowboys, right, they would start in Texas on what was called the long drive. So you see these cattle lines and sort of red here, and they would lead these sort of large scale herds of either longhorns. You guys know the Texas longhorns, the big longhorn cows, or later on they would use breeding to create more fat and better cows for consumption. But they would take them from giant herds in Texas, and they would march them north, eating the whole way. Like they would eat and eat while they walked, and they would drink from rivers, and this was the long drive until they reached a trail head that was called a railhead. So a railhead is where, like in Abilene, a very famous one. Here's Abilene, okay, in Kansas. Oglala up here in Nebraska. Dodge City, that's a really famous one. So these cattle locations, these cow towns, they became known as, would be where the cattle would be brought in and brought to like these wooden stockyards, and then they would be marched onto trains, and then the trains would deliver them to Chicago, okay, or to one of the other major meatpacking cities of America. Today, sort of a similar thing, but obviously now the herds are able to be put on trains a lot closer, and then now they're actually just killed where they are a lot of times. So what that led to is a rise of these cow towns, right? And that's where you have this sort of dynamic feature of the West that is so much a part of the mythology of the American West, and that is the gunslingers, right? These are the folks who wielded these weapons. The great line about God didn't make men equal, Colonel Colt did. And this is the great sort of legendary Colt 45. And here is where you start to have these sort of legendary outlaws, okay? Because what they would do is they would rob the pay of the cowboys. Like the people who are actually herding the cattle would get paid, and they would go into the saloons and spend their money and stuff. And so these guys would rob banks that were there. They would rob the train. They would rob the train quite often, in fact. And so that's where these lawless fellows like Jesse James and Billy the Kid come into the narrative of American history. And so, here you can read about Billy the Kid, who had killed 8 men before he was 21 and got shot himself. He was part of a range war. A range war is a war between cattle herders and sheep grazers, right? And so they would actually fight for turf in this area because sheep didn't need to roam. They needed to be fenced in, so to speak. And so what would happen is that you'd have these fences put up, and they would get in the way of the cows going through. And so the outlaws who would be paid would cut down the fences, and all havoc would ensue, kind of thing. Jesse James and the very famous James Gang were from Kansas and Missouri. I mean, they were bushwhackers. So if you remember Bleeding Kansas, these were the Bleeding Kansas guys that fought who just migrated west. They just kept being sort of lawless out there. Many of these were Confederate sympathizers. And they brought with them a sort of law of the gun, so to speak. Perhaps the most famous event in the Cowboy West, the gunslingers, is the shootout at the OK Corral. And the OK Corral is in Tombstone, Arizona, and it had these two lawmen, Wyatt and Virgil Earp, the Earp brothers, and their friend, the former outlaw, Doc Holliday, take on a group of cowboys called the Cowboys, Ike Clanton, and they got into a gunfight. These guys walked in, they're toting shotguns and big 45 revolvers, and they just blast away, killing this group of people. And so it was a big-time legendary story. Here's the Dodge City Peace Commission. You'll see Wyatt Earp down here, Bat Masterson, who was another fellow at the OK Corral. So I do want to point this picture out because one of the things that's interesting about all of these people, and I just saw a thing on this the other day, they didn't wear cowboy hats. They wore derbies. Very rarely would you see them wearing cowboy hats. The only ones who really wore cowboy hats were, well, cowboys, the guys who actually rode the plains, so to speak. But everybody else out west rarely ever wore a cowboy hat, like the Stetson, the famous cowboy hat. No, these guys wore iron derbies, they were called. So anyway, lawless period. It doesn't last long, as you might imagine. The government doesn't want to hear about shootouts, and so these marshals would be kind of legendary, like Wyatt Earp. But pretty quickly, the cattlemen are going to run into a problem, and that is these guys are in their way, right? Like if you think about where the long drive is, take a look. That's Kansas, right? That's right in the heart of Kansas. And who's pouring into Kansas? Well, homesteaders. And homesteaders are not, keep in mind, this is just open range territory. So they're buying the land in the open range and settling on it. And they're using John Deere's plow, which is the plow that broke the plains. This is how they got water out of the ground. This is a windmill. It actually ran a pump that extracted water. If you guys know anything about wind, the Great West is where most of our American solar power sources are and wind power sources, because the wind roars through the plains kind of thing, right? But probably the biggest impact on the long drive, the biggest impact was the reality of barbed wire. Because barbed wire, the problem with putting up fences in the West is there isn't any wood. Yeah, I mean, it's the Great Plains, there's no lumber. And so getting wood was very expensive. But if you've ever put up barbed wire, which I certainly have done, you don't need a whole lot to attach barbed wire to. If you pull the wire tight, we have a tool that does it, and you take a semicircular nail, it's like shaped like a U, and you hammer it in, and it can be in just a little pole, or it can be in metal. Barbed wire can be put up virtually anywhere. Well, cows can't go through that without getting messed up. And so this was a cheap solution to how to create borders and boundaries of property in the Great Plains. But man, it wrecked the long drive because cows couldn't go through it. And so that meant pretty quickly cattle driving had to stop. Plus, like I said earlier, these range wars were often between sheep herders. And by the way, sheep consume a ton of grass. So these sheep herders would want to be where available land was. It reminds me of like the Arabs, like where water and grass was. So they would be fighting over that between the cattle ranchers. In the end, this proved to be a very brief period, because what's going to happen is once industrialists discover there's wealth in it, they're going to start creating stock growers associations and corporations, right? And so a corporation, like think about the meatpacking industry, like Armour, Swift. Here in Virginia, we have a very famous poultry companies. Anybody know what chicken companies here in Virginia? Purdue, very good. Yeah, so we have all these big factories basically that are now farms. So ranches are mammoth, but they don't have to do the long drive anymore. And now we have, of course, air-conditioned trucks, air-conditioned train cars. So this period is fairly brief in history of the cattleman and the cowboy and the miner, but it certainly becomes part of the iconic nature of the West. But we want to focus the last part of this chapter on what will be the DBQ topic, and that is the farmer, the American farmer. Okay, and so certainly be aware of the cattlemen and be aware of the impact of it, but it is quickly going to go the corporate route as well. So let's take a look at rainfall. All right, if you know anything about rainfall, there's a spot where rainfall stops, basically. And you can kind of tell it from this. So if you're looking at this map, and you look at the map in page 587, which you don't have to right now, but if I were to hold these two maps side by side, settlement map, rainfall map, you would start to see an interesting pattern, right? Because that right there, the green, is where rainfall is enough every year to produce crops. You understand? So what happens is, because of the Rockies and what's called a rain shadow, is like dust. This is sort of dry, really dry, not sort of dry, it's like really dry. So what you should be looking at is like, what on earth are people doing here? Right? So what happens is people, once they start migrating west, this line right here is the 100th line of longitude, or the 100th meridian. Got it? And so if you went west of that, you were probably getting into a place where there was not enough rainfall. And yet people are going to do that. And that turned out to be a sort of reckless mistake. Now, what fuels all of this, of course, and here you can see again, the massive explosion in Western settlement, is the Homestead Act. So please don't forget about the Homestead Act. And here you can see they're slowly but surely filling in these lands. So here's South Dakota, right? You can see right here where the mining is in the Black Hills. But they're slowly going west of this because this is starting to, quote, fill up. So much so that by 1890, every territorial boundary has been determined. See them all cut up here? Every future state in the lower 48 has been determined. And there is settlement by 1890 in every one of them. And so that teaches us what Frederick Jackson Turner wrote about, which is the frontier thesis. Now, the narrative of the frontier, hopefully you can look at this beautiful picture and make a conclusion, is that life on the frontier was difficult, but pastoral to some degree, right? Like Little House on the Prairie. That is not true. In fact, Little House on the Prairie was probably a dirt hut built out of the sod that they came in on the wagon and just they deconstructed the wagon and made that the door, and then they built a mud hut, basically. All right, this is what it really looked like. All right, so they're basically like living in a dirt cave. Very, very hard lifestyle. Okay, and particularly in the Great Plains, because if you know anything about the Great Plains, it's where Tornado Alley is. So just imagine being in a tornado. It's like a dirt hut. So initially, what we might consider primitive. Wood was very scarce. Pretty much what you see here is what this family brought on the wagon. And then they deconstructed the wagon and built a house out of it. And that's what's left. So here is the map I was referencing. Here's where you have 30 inches or more of rainfall. That's us. Go west and it's less. And here's the 100th meridian. You see it up here? Once you get that, it's less than 20 inches of rainfall a year. If you're in the brown, it's less than 10 inches, which means how on earth can people survive there, right? It's very, very dry. Now, here is Turner, and I do want you to know his reasoning, his line. It's called The Significance of the Frontier. And for him, and I think for many Americans, the definition of being an American was being a part of a country whose citizens routinely moved westward. Like that was absolutely normal. Year after year, people went west, and once the frontier is closed, it's like a psychological toll to a degree. Now, I would point out, though, that people weren't listening to this guy, John Wesley Powell. So if you didn't read about John Wesley Powell, he's the guy who points out that the 100th meridian is where rain really starts dropping. He's like the head of the Geological Survey, and he tries to warn Americans that don't go past this, but we did. So looking back at my notes, just remember the Homestead Act is basically giving this land away for free. You only had to pay a nominal amount. Unfortunately, what that led to is a whole lot of fraud, meaning people would go out and fake, particularly corporations. Railroads would do this too. They would fake purchasing these, and then meaning the railroad would really buy it, not the actual person who would put down the money. And then you're supposed to improve on it with a 12 by 14 foot structure like that. That's a 12 by 14 foot structure. Problem is, and the book points this out, they would put like a dollhouse version in the 160 acres that was 12 inches by 14 inches. So lots of fraud just to buy up the land. So when we think about the Homestead Act, we think like people settled out west using the Homestead Act, and that's true. But a huge amount of it was settled by people who bought the land from speculators. So in other words, the speculators would get it from either the railroad or the government, and then they would flip it and charge a lot more to the homesteader. Okay, so I definitely would be familiar with that too. Particularly though, I want you to remember that here in Western Kansas and Western Nebraska, they're going to develop a type of plow that allows you to not go very deep into the soil. It breaks the hard topsoil. The topsoil is very hard. So this John Deere plow we were talking about up here somewhere, here it is. This thing would sort of cut a shallow furrow. In other words, it wasn't very deep, but the soil was still filled with nutrients. And people would do this a lot. This was how they farmed. And what happened is it busted up the topsoil. And unfortunately, most of the year it was very dry. And so what would happen is when the wind came through, it would just blow the topsoil away. And of course, the worst example of this is in the 1920s when you have the Dust Bowl, where the entire Kansas and Oklahoma, basically just rises up in dirt. And I'll show you pictures of that in the 1920s. So this is called dry farming. It's a shallow farming technique. It works, but it's not very, the crops are growing really shallow in the soil. So it's very vulnerable to wind erosion. And thus, these sod busters, so-called, are going to lay the conditions for what becomes the Dust Bowl, which is when the Midwest basically turns into one giant dust storm, or the West. Okay, so I want to introduce you guys to the first effort, and this is not, I think, in your reading, so you want to write this down somewhere, at least not in this chapter, to the first effort to recognize that land was a resource that was valuable and that it was going to need irrigation to in essence, reclaim. That's the word they use. They want to reclaim the land. The problem is the land doesn't have enough water. And so the first guy who creates a bill has the cool name of New Lands. Right? That's his name. That's not a description of the bill. And I used to think it was a description of the bill. The first time I ever read it, it was like New Lands Reclamation. Oh, they were creating new lands. Cool. No, the guy's name is Senator Newlands. That's his actual name. And so what this bill does, and this is under Theodore Roosevelt, is it starts irrigating dry areas to turn them into like salvageable, like areas where people can grow stuff. So we're going to see an effort on the part of, eventually, of Congress to try to help people living in this area. But what will finally solve the problem is a massive irrigation system. So you guys know what river runs through the Grand Canyon? It's the Colorado River. But the Colorado River touches 6 states as it runs through it. And so you're going to have the construction of things like the Hoover Dam later. And how many of you guys are aware of the city of Las Vegas, right? Las Vegas gets less than 10 inches of rainfall a year, and yet they're able to have golf courses there. And the reason for that is they bring water in from the Colorado River and from the Rocky Mountains. So today, the plains west of the 100th meridian are a large source of agriculture. And I definitely want y'all to know that, America's major export, number one export, is agricultural goods. It's foodstuffs. It's grain. And so it's these huge irrigation projects that are going to ultimately tame the West. The problem is the Colorado River is running out of water. Lakes along the river no longer exist. People used to have recreational lakes, and now they're not there anymore because the river has shrunk so much. And the reason for that is believed to be climate change, because there is no long-term, the amount of winter snow in the Rockies isn't what it used to be. They don't stay as long, it melts quick. And so this is one of those conditions where if you live in California or Nevada or Arizona, particularly Colorado, the fate of the Colorado River is important to them as the fate of the Dan River is to us. Like it's a crucial part of their livelihood. Okay, so anyway, lots of myth about the West. The West is going to become sort of the iconic. I don't know if you guys are familiar with like actors like John Wayne. I do know y'all are familiar with the Star Wars series. Star Wars is a Western in outer space. It's what it is. It's called a space opera sometimes, but really it's a Western theme. And that's because Lucas loved the movies of John Ford, who was America's great Western filmmaker. Western themes are in Steven Spielberg's movies. And of course, I mentioned earlier that Quentin Tarantino's last couple movies, Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight, Westerns, so we really love that culture. Popular show on television, Yellowstone right now. So I think in some ways the iconic idea of the West is really gone away. Like that never was here very long. It's kind of like the family farm. It's sort of become obsolete today, almost. But we kind of think that farms are like that. We kind of think that cowboys. So it's not really like that anymore. It's mostly factory and big business run. But that's okay. That's the way the West becomes part of our culture. Keep in mind, though, historically, whose narrative has not been included in that are African American cowboys, Hispanic cowboys, the role of women in the West. So there are elements of the West in the Western that are very iconic. Meaning, if you look at this picture, for example, this picture. It screams individualism. It screams self-reliance. When Philip Morris wanted to create an iconic character for their Marlboro cigarettes, they made a cowboy smoke, the Marlboro Man. So in many ways, we look at this and we think the masculine strength of the American West. Theodore Roosevelt will become a cowboy because he admires them so much. He wants to see what life in the West is like. And so even now, that's very much a part of our identity as Americans. Okay. So be familiar with that. And keep in mind, old cowboys discovered that a great way to make money is just to dress up and play cowboy for the folks back east. And so that would be operating a lariat, a lasso, or shooting like a marksman, a gifted marksman. So you'd have Buffalo Bill Cody, for example. Here he is with Sitting Bull. That they were on display like this at his show, like a zoo. Like you could go to the show right there, the Wild West show, and stand and look at Sitting Bull, in regalia. Over here you see Wild Bill Hickok with his friend Buffalo Bill Cody. Here's Wild Bill Hickok right here. There's Bill Cody and Texas Jack. So these guys were people who came east. Now, Wild Bill Hickok is going to go back west to be a miner, and that's when he gets shot in the back. Here you see Calamity Jane. That was Wild Bill's friend. She was an infamous drunk. Like she would drink till she was falling down. She was also gay, and so she was really, really tough. Like she was out west in a time when that wasn't when women didn't normally act like that. But she was best friends with Wild Bill Hickok, and then Annie Oakley was part of these shows, and she was, she would sit a gun, hold a mirror, and shoot out the ace of spades, the spade in it. She could do that from I don't know how many feet, long ways off. So if you've ever watched like gun show, like marksman shows, these would be women who did that kind of thing. Yeah, it was. I don't know how long it was. It's feet, I guess, but yeah, from a mirror too. So we're going to stop with the cowboys and switch to the farmers. Okay, so I have a whole different PowerPoint for the farmers, and I'm going to minimize this one and switch over to the farm folks. I think this is uploaded to your class work. Let me double check. This PowerPoint, that is. Wait a minute. No. America. Yeah, there it is. Period 6, populism in the election of 1896. So I do have it. All right, good. So this one is in there, but we're going to look at it again. So when we talk about the farmers, are the homesteaders. They're the people. I mean, when you were a homesteader, you were doing that to be a farmer. There really wasn't any other reason to create a homestead. All right. And so what these people are trying to accomplish is to go out on their own out west and make a go at it and grow crops and sell them for a profit. So, you know, they're not really designing their lifestyle to be subsistence farmers. They want to be cash crop farmers to a degree. And of course, they're growing cereals, you know, like grains. But the problem is for these farmers, and the prefix agrarian means farming. So this could easily just say an agricultural revolt. It's an adjective, okay? Are going to take up the mantle of a political movement called populism. Now, I have that in my videos, but let me explain what it literally means is of the people. Now, we've talked about the populace before, but this is where we want to dig into it full scale. And so the populists come from an idea that it's what the people want, regardless of whether or not it's healthy for the long-term future of the country. So populist messages and rhetoric are usually based on what people are angry about, simply put, what people are unhappy about. And that's cool. You know, people in America as a representative government need to express what we're not happy about. The problem is sometimes we're not happy about things that the government can't solve, right? Sometimes we're not happy about things that if the solution is given, it's worse for the country's future. And so this is where the debate about the role of government comes in. Do we elect people to simply do what we want them to do? Or do we elect people, that's representative, right? Or do we elect people to, so by the way, that's called a delegate model, where you elect someone, you delegate to them the role of representing what you want. So you expect the person you elect to do what you want. But the other role is what is called trustee, which means you elect someone who you trust is wise or smart enough to make the proper decisions that you may not be knowledgeable of. Okay? Well, populism is really based on delegation. Like when the people want something and they're not particularly concerned about being told why they shouldn't have it. You know, and often populism is angry, you know, angry about something. And so these are angry people. Now, here's what they were angry about. So this is a bit of a long list. In fact, it's longer than the list I gave you from the book. But it combines with some of the other things that are in the reading. So, for example, the problem for farmers is immediately their value of their crops are starting to decline, okay, in the 1870s. And that's partially because the number one answer, by the way, for that in a capitalist world is this. They're overproducing. Like, in other words, all of these 160-acre homesteaders aren't collectively getting together and saying, what should we set our price at so as not to, you know, lose money from each other? They're just selling it to whatever price they can get for it, right? Well, that means there's a whole lot of people producing stuff cheaply. Unfortunately, it's not cheap to be a farmer. Why isn't it cheap to be a farmer? Well, here is the list of things they are angry about. So definitely want to make sure of it. Now, some of it's kind of ridiculous. Like this one, there's not a whole lot the government can do about that, right? Like, what can the government do about nature? But nonetheless, that was a problem. There were routine, like you'd have flash floods, which would wash away all your crops. You'd have droughts, which happened all the time. There was an enormous locust storm that ate up the entire west, like crops one year. Like a thing of locusts just devoured everything whole year. There were blizzards. Teddy Roosevelt lost his entire herd of blooded bulls and cows in a blizzard. Went bust on that. Lost the whole ranch. So that was nature, and nature was problematic. But what they were particularly unhappy about were a group of businesses. So one business that they really were unhappy about was banks. Banks, they felt, were ripping them off, charging them too much interest. They were often having to mortgage their farms. You guys know what that means, like to take out a loan against the collateral of the value of their land or their house. Okay. They had to buy equipment. So that could be the combine, steel plows, all kinds of machinery. And you always had to keep up with the newest machinery. Otherwise, you would be not as productive. So machinery was very expensive, and they blamed the companies like the Harvester Trust. So they blamed monopoly for making the price of the stuff they bought, later tractors, things like that. But I guess I should kind of mix this up. companies they blame, and down here, huge company they blame, right? So the problem with the railroads is their shipping rates were too high. Farmers usually had to use short lines, which means from their little farm to somewhere not too far off. That meant they were charged more than the long rates were. So if you remember our discussion on the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, and the first law, this came as a complaint about that, where they wanted to prohibit things like rebates and pools and the price gouging of the railroads to the farmer. Okay. The government charged them high taxes, they felt. Now, you could debate whether or not the taxes were high or not. This is their perspective. Their hatred of corporations was almost entirely, like almost complete. They did not get tariffs. So if you're a Republican during this period, high tariffs, farm goods weren't protected under that. So it protected industry, but not agriculture, which meant everything you bought was with a tariff on it, protected. Everything you sold did not have that. And so their solution was this. Deflation. Yes, make more money. This is their solution, okay? This is a big. So, when we talked about earlier, the Greenback Labor Party or the People's Party, the Populist Party, this is their major platform, is that if you print more money, we will be able to pay back our loans because your interest rate won't change with inflation. So you can pay back your mortgage easier, right? Because you got more money in your hand. You can pay down your loan on your machinery easier, right? And so for them, putting more money in circulation, because they didn't view themselves as consumers. They hardly ever bought anything. I mean, mail order maybe and seeds. But when they bought something, it was a big ticket item, like a machine, right? So they want reform of all this, but their number one problem is down here, I think. They're disorganized. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of individual farmers. And there's no such thing as a farmers union in the 1870s. So the first step towards having a farmers union is the Grange. So you definitely want to remember the Grange. Founded right after the Civil War, the Grange was founded by Oliver Kelly. You'll notice just in its imagery, it was modeled by the Masons. Kelly was a Mason, and so he was going to create a farms Mason. And we've talked about this before. And so what the Grange did is it set up places so that people could communicate with each other. Okay? And they also had dances and schools, but they succeeded here. Now, if you're thinking, what kind of undermined this? What hurt the Granger laws? Okay, that's cool. Wabash versus Illinois. Okay, I heard somebody. Yeah, Wabash versus Illinois. So do you remember the Granger laws were designed to regulate railroads, to limit how much railroads could charge. And unfortunately for the farmer, that was interstate commerce. And thus these laws were unconstitutional if they affected interstate commerce. Also in the 1870s, you may recall there was something called the Panic of 1873, right? So nobody really wants to listen to people complain about not doing well when everybody feels like they're not doing well, right? Like, oh, you're just join the list, right? Join the club. So the Grange was, a sort of temporary step, but I wanted to remind you that this is what sets them back. Now, I do want to give you one court case that gave the Grange hope, and that's one of the reasons why this case kind of hurt them, and they were surprised. The first case involving, and it's not in your book, but I'm giving it to you. The first case involving whether or not a state could regulate a business was Munn versus Illinois, and it was a business's rates for using grain elevators. So you know anything about that? That means like you would bring your grain, usually by a horse-drawn, large-scale wagon kind of situation, and then you would unload it, and there would be an elevator to take it up and dump it in these tall, silos, these tall grain storage containers. And they were charging them a lot. At least that's what they felt. And so they sued them, or they actually passed a law saying you can't charge it so much. And that was upheld because the grain elevator is located entirely within the state. Thus, it's not interstate commerce, right? 10 years later, though, you can't regulate a railroad that's coming from, in this case, from Kentucky, I think it was, or certainly through Missouri, to Missouri, because it's interstate commerce. So definitely remember that. Here's a great picture. Remember, what Grangers like to talk about, and I think they were right, is that none of the other industry in the world would exist without food. And so Americans would do well to remember that the Granger pays everyone's bill, because if you don't have a farm feeding America, then workers are going to demand super high wages. Because what will food be? It'll be a lot more expensive. So the reason why the Industrial Revolution is happening so easily, these guys are arguing, is because we're providing so much food for you. You don't have to import any food. You know, we've got tons of it. And they're going to make that argument, but they're not going to get very sympathetic ears from the factory owners out of that. Now, our next point I'd like to draw to is, so if you're making notes on this, you want to sort of trace the evolution of the agrarian movement. You understand that? Trace the evolution of the farmers as a group. And so you start with the Grange, but the Grange was never really much more than an effective social club in terms of long-term history. Now, keep in mind, the Grange lasted a long time, but the laws are not effective enough. So the next group that are formed is called the Farmers Alliances, and there are two different ones, okay? So you have the Southern Alliance and the Northern Alliance. Keep in mind, Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, these are farm states. You know, we often think about Illinois and we think Chicago, but that's right on the Great Lakes. The rest of Illinois is a farm state. And they are going to focus much less on the social organization of the Grange, you know, if you think about like the club nature of it, and much more on getting laws passed, political. And so they're going to be the first really political movement to run candidates for office, and they will succeed in that respect. They're going to get a lot of people elected to office. Now, in their states, obviously, Western states, farm states, but they are beginning to make a note, you know. So I'd definitely be aware of the Farmers Alliances. Now, I want to point out they were discriminatory. They did not include blacks in their alliance. And it's unfortunate because Southern blacks made up a large percentage of farmers. Now, they were sharecroppers, but they certainly were farmers. So the Farmers Alliances did very, very well. And right before 1890's election, they're going to merge and form the Farmers Alliance. Now, if you look at this picture, it's really lovely, right? It's the American flag, Columbia. You got farmers over here. Except if you look at it and think about what it's saying, the combined forces of united labor will prove invincible in their onslaught. So here you have the K of L. That's the Knights of Labor, right? So what the Farmers Alliance is proposing is nothing short of radical, and that is a union of farmers and factory workers, right? Now, what's going on in Russia at this time is the idea in the head of guys like Karl Marx, or actually the ideas of guys like Lenin, of joining those two groups, right? Farmers and factory workers. So when I talk about being middle class in America, this is one of the closest moments where if we were going to adopt full-scale socialism or even communism, it could happen here because they're talking the same kind of rhetoric. They're just not talking about Marx, right? They're farmers and factory workers uniting. And so in 1890, they're actually going to have a platform. A platform is what's used in a convention to explain what the party believes. So it's like the party's mission statement. You're going to want to be familiar with this platform. So they meet down in Florida and they make a list. And so just look at a few of the items they want. No more national banks. Okay. They want banks that are regional in nature that will make loans easier. That's what Democrats have wanted all along, right? Cheap loans, cheap access to credit. Sub-treasuries, which will loan the money directly to the people at a low rate of interest. In other words, they want to abolish banking and have the government just loan the money to them at a low rate of interest. They want to increase the amount of money in circulation. So that should translate to you as inflation. Okay? No, this group has never been for deflation. Don't think that. Never. The farmers are never advocating deflation. Okay? What are you analogizing that with? They want to increase in the monetary supply.
On one of the slides, it did say
Deflation? That's their problem. Their grievance is deflation. That's not what they want. That's what they're upset about. Remember, the amount of money in circulation shrunk during Grant's presidency. So that's the late 1860s and 70s, or mid 70s. Under him, you had the so-called crime of 73, right? Which is the demonetization of silver. And you had the Redemption Act, which took greenbacks out of circulation. So the amount of money per capita in America shrinks during the Gilded Age. And so they're not happy about that. They want inflation. So I'm sorry if I confused you, but they're upset about deflation. They'd rather have inflation as a solution. Okay, so they want basically no banks, or get rid of banks as lenders. I guess banks could store money but not lend it. They want inflation, all right? And the silver bill that they're talking about, which I think is cool that they write it like that, is the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Because they're not actually, while they're buying silver, they're not minting it and putting it out into circulation. So they condemn both the Bland-Allison Act and the Sherman Act as not making silver money. In other words, not making it by metal. It's just purchasing them silver. All right, no taxes or removal of taxes, tariffs. Right, so definitely removal of that's a biggie. Okay, get rid of that. And then look at this one: a graduated tax on incomes. So these guys are income tax advocates. Oops, excuse me. And they want a direct election of senators. Well, at the time, senators were selected by state legislatures. So what that means is here in Virginia, the Richmond General Assembly would vote and elect a senator. And they felt that was not democratic because the legislature of the state was dominated by wealthy interests. You understand? So they wanted to have more democratic access to who senators. Because keep in mind, senators were really the people that were seen as the most kind of corrupt. Senators were the ones that were seen as the most loyal to big industries. So they would be like the senator from U.S. Steel, as opposed to the senator from Pennsylvania. You see what I'm saying? Like that, they were representative of a business and not even representative of people. I don't know if you guys followed like this kerfluffle with Ted Cruz leaving Texas, going to Mexico or whatever, and got a bunch of blowback. The criticism, of course, of that was he seemed out of touch with the people of Texas by doing that, right? Well, these people felt like their senators were completely out of touch with what their interests were. All right, so they wanted that to happen, and today we have that. We have just to remind you, kind of contextually, this is the 16th Amendment, and this is the 17th Amendment. All right, so we get some of this stuff, as well as this happens, the reduction of tariffs. All right, now we're not going to do away with banks. Good luck with that, right? Yeah. But the good news is there's so much gold and silver out there, they're going to start getting more money made anyway. All right. But what they decide to do is run a bunch of candidates. And then the Northern Alliance decides, wait a minute, we're not going to join with these guys because they're going to be Democrats. So what happens is Southerners are going to continually demand to be Democrats, Southern partners. Right? They want to basically take over the Democratic Party, kind of like the way some Republicans feel Trump supporters kind of took over the Republican Party from the George W. Bush, John McCain era. There's kind of a sense that the far right is now in control of the party. You could argue that one way or the other. The Northern Alliance decides not to run a farmers alliance then with the Southern. So they meet again, these farmers alliances, and form a new party called the what? The Populist Party, right? The People's Party. Here it is. And this time, initially, they were open to African Americans, as well as other groups like the Greenback Labor Party. So that's where you have this hilarious criticism cartoon come from of the platform of lunacy. Now, obviously, the person who made this cartoon is like a pro-business anti-populist because he's calling it what? What's the title? Lunacy, right? Well, that's not a nice thing to say. Not a very complimentary depiction of it. But if you look up here at this platform, at this party, you see there's the Prohibition Party. That's the people from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Anthony Comstock, the people want to outlaw alcohol. You've got the old Grangers, but then up here you got socialists. Down here you got communists. Over here you got free silver. Here you got farmers' alliances. And here you got anarchists, women's rights, greenbackers, knights of labor. So it's basically the common man, right? But obviously not in a way that's complimentary, right? This person's definitely critical of the Populist Party. So what do the populists do? And we've talked about them before, but let's go ahead and dig in. They start out of Nebraska, but in reality, they're just the next step of these people. There's just these people rejoined with another name. So one of the things that's confusing is if you don't think of it as an evolution, then you're missing the point. So go Grange. I would mention, and I'm sorry I didn't put it in this PowerPoint, but don't forget about the Greenback Labor Party. That was the first political party organized around the idea of inflation, 1878. Then you have the Farmers Alliance running candidates. But now you have a full-blown party. Now, I will tell you this. Pretty soon after their formation, they're going to dump African Americans from the list. And that's unfortunate. But they're going to make an argument that some people are that you can't win a national race if you don't have white Southerners vote for you. And you're not going to get white Southern votes for a party that has black votes in it. Make sense? I mean, at least it made sense to them. So Tom Watson is going to kick out African Americans. Okay. And then, of course, later on, the populists are going to become full-blown nativists. But take a look again at what they want. So the Omaha platform is very similar to the Ocala platform. All right. Sub-treasuries, that was in the Ocala. That's a farmers' alliance. Abolition of a national bank, farmers' alliances. Direct election of senators, farmers' alliances. But this is socialist. Okay. As is this. So before, if you want to look at the groups that are making these demands, you'll see kind of like where each group is in here. So these are Farmers Alliance. Call them F Alliance. Okay, Farmers. Farmers. Framers. Type. All right. Whoa. Don't hit control buttons while you're typing, y'all. Now, direct election of senators was like everybody. Pretty much every reformer agreed with that. So, like, if you look at that patchwork quilt, everybody on that list wanted direct election of senators. Okay, so that wasn't just a farmer issue. But here is an interesting one: nativist and factory workers. They don't like to have the competition. 8-hour workday, unions. Abolition of the Pinkertons, unions. Australian secret ballot, everyone. That means before the 1890s, when you voted, it was publicly, like people saw how you voted. So your corporate owner, your boss, could have an observer at the polls watching how his employees voted. And if he was not happy with the way they voted, they would not have a job the next day. The bosses, political bosses, could stand there and have people intimidate you. So they're like, we want a secret ballot where nobody knows how we vote, which is how we have it today, right? But, as you can see, Australia had that first. Farmers. Everyone. Right? More or less. So what I would like to say about the populists is they're a collection of many groups, okay? But most notably the farmers. So this is what they're looking for here. This government-owned company. And it's not like they don't have a precedent. Does anybody know a government-owned company in America? Say again? The Postal Service, absolutely. Anybody know another one? Didn't exist then, but exists now. Okay, it's called Amtrak, American Railway Company, American Corporation, for trains. It's a government-owned business. So they're thinking this is doable, particularly on the big businesses, right? And so they run a candidate, James Weaver. And by the way, James Weaver used to be the Greenback Labor Party. And like I said the last time we talked about this, Weaver does, for a third-party candidate, Weaver does surprisingly well. He wins 4 states outright. See, he wins an elector from Oregon and an elector from North Dakota. So if I'm a populist, I recognize that I probably can't win purely on Western votes, but I do recognize I can get votes. And I want to remind you that Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland weren't that different when it came to business and railroads and things like that. Keep in mind, it was Grover Cleveland during this presidency that broke up the Pullman strike. It was Grover Cleveland who worked with, J.P. Morgan. So these agrarian farmer types and factory workers don't feel like the political parties in America represent them. I would argue Trump supporters felt the same way. So I believe, and I think history will write it this way, that the 2016 election was a populist takeover of the Republican Party. In other words, President Trump, as an ultimate outsider, right, a guy who never held any elected office, never served in the military, never held any kind of role in the United States government, being elected was a definite populist moment. And it was they stick it to the Republican Party just as much as it was pro-Republican. What happened is some people didn't like that and didn't vote for him in the 2020 election. The people who are less populist. So that's an interesting thing. The problem, of course, with bimetallism is nature had fixed the problem. Lots of gold had been discovered. Silver was so plentiful, it should not be coined at 16-1. Right? In other words, the ratio in real life was not 16-1, and yet that's what the populace kept demanding. And we talked about inflation being a major problem because, not having inflation for them, because you can see here the price that they're receiving for their product is not the break-even point. So there was no Black Friday for these guys. They did not break even that year. So that meant they went deeper in debt each year. And ultimately, most of them, a great number of the farmers went bankrupt. Huge number. Okay. And we've talked about this, so I don't need to revisit the silver matter too much, but you certainly want to remember both the crime of 73, so-called, keep in mind that's what the opponents of it called it, the Bland-Allison Act and the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, none of which created bimetallism, or recreated it. And so here again is a good example. While the population went up, right, from there to there, the amount of money in circulation went down a lot. And you didn't get back to 1865 until 20 years later. So when I hear people talking about opposition to the minimum wage increase, I get it. And I get that number 15 is a big number, the dollar sign. But I also know that the minimum wage was 7.25 11 years ago. Right? 11 years ago. So what that means is it has not risen with the cost of living at all, and so I don't know what the magic number should be for what the minimum American worker should make. But the notion that 11 years hasn't changed anything is not accurate. Now, I'm not advocating for $15. Like I said, I don't know. But I think these folks had a fair argument. Deflation took money out of circulation. They actually didn't have, so money was more scarce. And that obviously meant if you were rich, you were richer. And they liked it. They liked that a lot. So then the thing that was the first major setback for the populace was this. Okay. So with the panic, you really didn't have a leg to stand on, it seemed, if you were a farmer, because everybody, if a factory worker, these people are out of work. And when you're desperate, there's two things that happen. When you're unemployed, you're willing to protest. Because what else are you going to do? Right. But the problem is that you can't get a job because there's a scarcity of them. So during this panic, you can imagine what 3 million unemployed people was like. Remember, this depression was really just almost a continuation of a previous depression. And President Cleveland didn't do anything about it. That wasn't in our style to use the type of, well, just yesterday, Jerome Powell, who's the head of the Federal Reserve, said, we're going to continue purchasing U.S. bonds and keeping interest rates low throughout the whole pandemic because we need money in circulation. So the government has been pumping money into circulation, right? Stimulus. The federal government has kept interest rates continuously low. And that's why we haven't felt the pinch as bad. Well, none of that existed in 1895. There was no such thing as the government manipulating interest rates or purchasing federal bonds. And there sure as heck wasn't going to be the president stepping in and saying, let's get stimulus passed, right, for the average American. So none of that existed, things that we're used to. So these farmers were angry. They were angry. They were mad at the price of interest. They were mad at foreclosures on their homes and farms. They were mad about crippling debt. What do you think a lot of ordinary Americans are angry about now? The cost of college tuition, the cost of health care. This is what they're angry about. The people who elected Donald Trump really believed that he was going to, fix the banking problem in America that led to the Great Recession. That didn't happen. I think the banks today are pretty much immune from much overwatch from either side, unless you start getting into the far left. So one of the things that's often unfortunate about populist rhetoric, and it was this case as well, this past election, is that there's frequently bigotry involved, which means anti-immigrant, nativist type, right? So one of the things President Trump captured was a dislike of illegal immigrants, a heavy one. Used some ugly rhetoric describing immigrants in third world countries as well. But in 1892, a large number of populists blamed the Jews. The Jews were the sort of scapegoat of the 1890s, particularly because Jews were involved in banking. And so they put J.P. Morgan and his Wall Street cronies as Jewish, even though Morgan's not Jewish, but they blamed them with the Jews of England and said that these guys were all just sort of both parties. Here's Cleveland, here's Harris. They're both just ripping off the American worker. The U.S. is in the hand of the Jews. So anti-Semitism was one of the ugly sides, as was racism towards African Americans, an element of the populace. But the farmers are angry. They were really angry, and so this is, I think, the first time since the Civil War where America came close to real internal conflict. Had these folks used violent language, which fortunately they didn't. The anarchists did. The anarchists were killing people during this period, but these folks weren't. They were proud Americans. They didn't want to shoot people, but they wanted their government to do something about it. Okay. Now, an example of a protest, and this is really one of the most fascinating protests to me because it's the first that I am aware of March on Washington. You guys heard of the March on Washington, I'm sure, right? Martin Luther King. But this was a March on Washington. It starts in Ohio, and that word is commonweal. It's not a misspell. It's just another way to spell commonwealth, which I didn't know until I read about it. But this guy takes a whole bunch of miners and protesters who are demanding bimetallism and walk towards Washington. The march, though, the march to Washington sort of peters out by the time he gets there, and he gets arrested. They get arrested for basically for what's it called? Where you loitering, like they're on the grounds of the Capitol protesting, and they get arrested because they call it loitering. Today, you have the right to assemble, but apparently they couldn't walk on the grass. So he goes to prison, as you can see here. But he becomes a sort of symbol of the populist movement. You see the People's Party down here, and emancipate, free labor, give work to the unemployed. So they're actually asking for like 8-hour workday, infrastructure, help unemployed people. So they're asking for the government, and that's why the populists are so important, because they're the first large group in American history to ask the federal government for something. Like help us, government. And so what happens is their rhetoric gets popular. Like people are like, yeah, we're hurting. Times are hard. And you can see here, their support increases an enormous amount, almost doubles, right? And the Democratic Party loses its Western voters. So in other words, the Democratic Party of Grover Cleveland, right? You look out here, California, Texas, Missouri, they voted for Cleveland. But now, 1894, they're not that interested in Cleveland anymore. He certainly isn't their guy. And so I'm going to stop with this today. And on Monday, we're going to finish the story of the populists with the election of 1896, which is an enormously important event in history. It's really the end of an entire party system and the start of a new era. So we'll stop with that for today, and I'll pick up on Monday. You guys can certainly ask me questions.